Hello everyone, it's Saoirse, and we have reached the end of Titanic week. If you don't know what that means, 111 years ago the Titanic had her maiden voyage, and we all know what happened at the end of it. Today is April 16th, and 111 years ago the survivors of Titanic would have been on the rescue ship, the Carpathia. So today I wanted to wrap up the week with a book about Titanic, and this is a really, really cool one, probably my favorite that I've read so far. I am very interested in Titanic. If you didn't know this by now, where have you been? It is probably my number one interest. We're in my Titanic corner at the moment. We have Thomas Andrews, the shipbuilder. You can't really see her, but Molly Brown is up there, Countess of Roths, and Titanic herself. And we've got our White Star Line blanket. We've got our third class cup here. There it is. And our first class teapot. Isn't it so pretty? I went to the Titanic artifact exhibition in Orlando a few days ago. I had never been there before. I know that's shocking. And they were having a speaker series to commemorate the anniversary. And I got to see historians and a diver who's been to the wreck of Titanic. And I actually met a survivor descendant, a man whose father was on the Titanic and survived. And I met the creative director of Titanic Honor and Glory, which is a virtual project that will one day allow us to walk the decks of Titanic and explore every inch of the ship. Hopefully with a virtual reality type thing. I'm so excited about that. So it was really like one of the best days of my life. I really felt like I was around my people and I could just nerd out. And my mom and I did the first class dinner gala there, where they have actors portraying some of the famous people on the ship, such as Molly Brown and Thomas Andrews. Very, very cool. So I've just been completely wrapped up in Titanic this week. So this was the perfect book to be reading this week. So it's Titanic First Accounts, and this was published in 2012 for the 100-year anniversary of Titanic. And it's edited by Tim Malton. It's got an afterword by Nicholas Wade, who is Lawrence Beesley's grandson. Lawrence Beesley was a survivor of the Titanic. And yeah, it's got, there were some survivors who wrote books or wrote accounts of their survival, and it's got some of that. And then it's also got newspaper articles, and it has reports from the inquiries, because there was an American and a British inquiry after the disaster. So let's dig in. I will try not to give too much commentary and just like give you some of the quotes that really moved me or stood out, but you know I end up rambling. So in the introduction, it talks about how Archibald Gracie, who a large portion of the book is his account, and he survived but then died later that year, which is really sad. He died in December. It says his obituary in the New York Times the following day stated, "After the Carpathia had brought the Titanic survivors to New York, Colonel Gracie did nothing to banish the tragedy from his thoughts. On the contrary, he spent the succeeding months in correspondence with other survivors, gathering data for his book, The Truth About the Titanic. The events of the night of the wreck were constantly on his mind. The manuscript of his work on the subject had finally been completed and sent to the printers when his last illness came. In his last hours, the memories of the disaster did not leave him. Rather, they crowded thicker, and he was heard to say, 'We must get them into the boats. We must get them all into the boats.'" It's just chilling. And so many stories really are a clear example of PTSD, which at the time obviously was not widely discussed. I don't even know when the term PTSD came about, much later. So think about all the people who had to keep a stiff upper lip, because that's just what you did back then. And there are so many accounts in here of people saying that it was so honorable how no one was showing fear. I mean, you just couldn't show fear, or you were a coward. And yeah, it's very sad that he obviously, until his last moment, still had this horrific memory just haunting him. 100 years on, the world is still gripped by the Titanic disaster. This is because Titanic, the floating city, is a metaphor for the whole of civilization, and her untimely death at the hand of God or nature is a metaphor for the human condition. The story of the Titanic shows us our utter helplessness, our best achievement confounded by a lump of ice, and leaves us asking the eternal question, why? The Titanic forces us to confront this question, which generations of experts and newcomers have grappled with, turning for more information to the first accounts of those who were there. That's really well stated. I think I was trying to figure out, why am I so hyper-focused on Titanic? Why are so many people still fascinated by it over 100 years later? And it is because it represents everything and all of us, and the end of an era, and we all can ask ourselves, what do we think we would have done? Do we know what we would have done? And it's a great example of the human race as a whole experiencing grief all at once, no matter what class you're part of, no matter what society thinks of you. We all feel pain and grieve, and we all feel fear, whether or not we felt like we're allowed to show it. This is an interesting point from a piece by Lawrence Beasley. He wrote The Loss of the Titanic. It says, an experienced officer has told me that he has seen a boat lowered in practice from a ship's deck with a trained crew and no passengers in the boat, with practiced sailors paying out the ropes in daylight, in calm weather, with the ship lying in dock, and has seen the boat tilt over and pitch the crew headlong into the sea. And then he says, contrast these conditions with those obtaining that Monday morning at 12:45 a.m., and it is impossible not to feel that, whether the lowering crew were trained or not, whether they had or had not drilled since coming on board, they did their duty in a way that argues the greatest efficiency. So there are so many what-ifs about this tragedy, and one of them that people bring up is the lifeboats, the fact that there wasn't much preparation. I mean, I think they were assigned to their lifeboats, that officers knew where they were supposed to be, but passengers clearly did not know where they were supposed to be. And the people lowering the boats, like it's saying, lowering a lifeboat at this time in the best conditions was really, really difficult. And lowering them with tons of people in them during an obvious, well, some people didn't believe the ship was really sinking, but as time went on, it became more apparent. And then, yeah, lowering them in the conditions that they had, I can't imagine. So it's really amazing that they managed to get the boats to the water safely for the most part at all. Anyway, I said I wasn't gonna comment so much. Okay, we had no eyes for anything but the ship we had just left. As the oarsmen pulled slowly away, we all turned and took a long look at the mighty vessel towering high above our midget boat, and I know it must have been the most extraordinary sight I shall ever be called upon to witness. I realize now how totally inadequate language is to convey to some other person who was not there any real impression of what we saw. This is such a great book because these are the actual survivors' words. This isn't, a biographer or a historian writing it. It's coming from them, and even they say that you will never know what it was like unless you were there. And that's so powerful because we can try and imagine it, but only those people know, and they're all gone now. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough, I guess, World War One came along and kind of swept Titanic aside because it was only a couple years after. And so the world kind of lost interest. And once it became normal to record video, um, they weren't really doing that with the survivors. So when they found the Titanic wreck in 1985, then there was a lot of renewed interest in the wreck and talking to survivors. But there was this massive period in between where most of the survivors died off. And then the ones who had memories, they were almost all gone at that point. So it just, it kills me that we don't have, video record of survivors talking about the wreck. We have some, but not a whole lot. So I'm glad that we have these accounts, and I can't believe I didn't look into this stuff before. And next, the cold air. Here again was something quite new to us. There was not a breath of wind to blow keenly round us as we stood in the boat, and because of its continued persistence to make us feel cold. It was just a keen, bitter, icy, motionless cold that came from nowhere, and yet was there all the time. The stillness of it, if one can imagine cold being motionless and still, was what seemed new and strange. Imagine that, just constant cold that's biting at you. And, I mean, it's good that there was no wind, but yeah, no, I can't imagine being that cold. And just floating in the middle of a dark ocean. He's talking about how he wanted to see the ship from far away, because when he boarded, there wasn't enough room to step back and really see the entire ship. I had often wanted to see her from some distance away, and only a few hours before, in conversation at lunch with a fellow passenger, had registered a vow to get a proper view of her lines and dimensions when we landed in New York, to stand some distance away to take in a full view of her beautiful proportions, which the narrow approach to the dock at Southampton made impossible. Little did I think that the opportunity was to be found so quickly and so dramatically. Imagine that the first time you really see the whole ship and it's sinking. Now he's describing the noise. Where is this? There came a noise which many people, wrongly I think, have described as an explosion. It has always seemed to me that it was nothing but the engines and machinery coming loose from their bolts and bearings, and falling through the compartments, smashing everything in their way. It was partly a roar, partly a groan, partly a rattle, and partly a smash, and it was not a sudden roar as an explosion would be. It went on successively for some seconds, possibly 15 to 20, as the heavy machinery dropped down to the bottom, now the bows of the ship. I suppose it fell through the end and sank first, before the ship, but it was a noise no one had heard before, and no one wishes to hear again. It was stupefying, stupendous, as it came to us along the water. It was as if all the heavy things one could think of had been thrown downstairs from the top of a house, smashing each other and the stairs and everything in the way. So they're already in a vast ocean, on a tiny boat, in the dark, freezing, and seeing this gargantuan thing go down into the water, and now it's making this horrific sound that is described by so many people throughout this, and sounded like an explosion to them. I can't even imagine. I would be terrified. But then, I don't know, what was it like to be raised in this time where you were not supposed to feel fear? And it was really like that for the men. A lot of the men say, because I was a man, I had to stay calm for the ladies, and women are weaker and hysterical and all that stuff. In place of the Titanic, we had the level sea now stretching in an unbroken expanse to the horizon, heaving gently just as before, with no indication on the surface that the waves had just closed over the most wonderful vessel ever built by man's hand. The stars looked down just the same, and the air was just as bitterly cold. And then he's talking about how there need to be more lifeboats. It is not possible that ever again can such conditions exist, but it is a duty imperative on one and all to see that they do not. Think of it, a few more boats, a few more planks of wood nailed together in a particular way at a trifling cost, and all those men and women whom the world can so ill afford to lose would be with us today. There would be no mourning in thousands of homes which are now desolate, and these words need not have been written. And I would add, because it's a misconception that if they had more boats that everybody would have survived, but they didn't even have time to launch the boats that they did have. So in addition to obviously having the correct number of boats, having a lifeboat drill where everybody knew exactly what to do, that was essential, and it wasn't like that. So yeah, it's those two things, because then maybe they could have gotten everybody off the ship safely in time. It wasn't very much time. This is okay, so this is from Archibald Gracie's The Truth About the Titanic. Sometime before 6 o'clock, full of contentment, they told me of the message of, this is about the Strausses. You've probably heard the story of Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, the owners of Macy's, who went down with the ship. It says, I recall how Mr. and Mrs. Strauss were particularly happy about noontime on this same day in anticipation of communicating by wireless telegraphy with their son and his wife on their way to Europe on board the passing ship America. Sometime before 6 o'clock, full of contentment, they told me of the message of greeting received in reply. This last goodbye to their loved ones must have been a consoling thought when the end came a few hours thereafter. That was just very touching and nice to know that they did get to contact their son one more time before they died that night. And here's more about the Strausses. That says the self-abnegation of Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Strauss here shone forth heroically when she promptly and emphatically exclaimed, No, I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so will we die together. And when he too declined the assistance proffered on my earnest solicitation that because of his age and helplessness, exception should be made, and he be allowed to accompany his wife in the boat. No, he said, I do not wish any distinction in my favor which is not granted to others. As near as I can recall them, these were the words which they addressed to me. They expressed themselves as fully prepared to die, and calmly sat down in steamer chairs on the glass-enclosed deck A, prepared to meet their fate. But then there was one transcendent piece of heroism that will remain fixed in my mind as the most sublime and coolest exhibition of courage and cheerful resignation to fate and fearlessness of death. This was when a reluctant refusal of assistance met with the ringing response in the deep manly voice of a powerful man who in his extremity replied, All right, boys, good luck and God bless you. I have often wished that the identity of this hero might be established and an individual tribute to his memory preserved. This was when Gracie was on the overturned lifeboat that I think around 30 men were standing on all night, and they had to keep telling people in the water, no, don't get on the boat, you're going to swamp us. Because the boat is upside down, and they're standing on the bottom of the boat with a little air pocket that's keeping it afloat. And so yeah, just this idea of this man saying, all right, boys, good luck and God bless you, and he swims off and they all know that's it, he's going to die. And there's this, I don't know, this fixation with accepting death and being fearless about death as being so honorable. And somehow it's still, even today, with modern viewpoints on the situation, it's hard not to think that that does sound really heroic. But at the same time, why should they have had to be so? Why should I don't know what I'm trying to say. Why did they have to be so stoic about death? You know, and why does that make us cry when we hear about it? It's just interesting. So he's talking about how why it would have been so hard to see the iceberg. And so usually there would be waves beating against the side of the iceberg, but this was an exceptionally calm night. In our case, the beautiful starlit night and cloudless sky combined with the glassy sea further facilitated the iceberg's approach without the detection, for no background was afforded against which to silhouette the deadly outline of this black-appearing protean monster, which only looks white when the sun is shining upon it. So I thought that was an interesting point. It looks white in the sunlight, but at night there's no light to bounce off of it, and the icebergs just look black. So now there's this whole section where Gracie gives us every detail of every single lifeboat on port side and starboard side. During the same interval, by correspondence with survivors and by reading all available printed matter in books, magazine articles, and newspapers, I have become still more conversant with the story of this, the greatest of maritime disasters, which caused more excitement in our country than any other single event that has occurred in its history within a generation. And that's the truth. This, you can't overstate how massive this was around the world, not just in the States. I mean, it was the biggest news, the biggest event, the biggest tragedy, and would only be overshadowed by World War I starting a couple years later. I mean, people just couldn't believe it, and I always see it as this ending of of the Edwardian era, of this excess of wealth and, this, they weren't as straight-laced as the Victorians. I think people kind of conflate the two eras, and this was much more, let's have fun and let's be completely over the top and gaudy, and it's just excess, excess, excess. And that to have this ship that really symbolized all of that, symbolized just completely crazy luxury, to have that be swallowed up by the sea. You see how that feels very symbolic to the ending of that era. They thought that they had just built the biggest thing ever built by man's hand, the biggest moving object. And there was a lot of hubris, I guess, involved in this, and a lot of people just were thinking that was man getting too proud, and it had to end, and it had to end in a terrible way. So this is a statement by Harold Bride, who is the junior Marconi operator. And let's see. He said, then followed a general scramble out onto the boat deck, but no sooner had we got there than the sea washed over. I managed to catch hold of the boat which we had previously fixed up and was swept overboard with her. I then experienced the most exciting 3 or 4 hours anyone can reasonably wish for, and was in due course with the rest of the survivors picked up by the Carpathia. I just thought that's like the understatement of the century. The most exciting 3 or 4 hours anyone can reasonably wish for. I love the way that people talk in this time. And then this made me laugh. Jay Collins is being interviewed during the inquiry, and he says, We were just turning round to make for the stern when a wave washed us off the deck, washed us clear of it, and the child was washed out of my arms. I was kept down for at least 2 or 3 minutes underwater. Senator Bourne says, 2 or 3 minutes? Mr. Collins says, yes, I am sure. Senator Bourne, were you unconscious? Mr. Collins, no, not at all. It did not affect me much, the salt water. Senator Bourne, but you were underwater? You cannot stay underwater 2 or 3 minutes. That just got me. He just keeps pushing him you were not underwater for 2 or 3 minutes. But there's so many examples in here of people just completely losing sense of time, which absolutely makes sense. This is something that happens that's observable in our brains when a traumatic event is occurring. Let's see. Oh, is this Charles Jockin? The head baker. We love the baker. The baker is the one who, if you've seen the James Cameron movie Titanic, he's on the back of the ship next to Rose as the ship takes its final plunge. And in real life, he's a really interesting character. He kept going back to his room and drinking, and it's believed that he survived in the water because he was on the back of the ship, just like in the movie, and says that he sort of rode the Titanic into the water like an elevator and stepped off as it went under and barely. He said he didn't even go underwater, like his head didn't go underwater and maybe it was wetted and that's it. But then he was in the water for about 2 hours. Most people wouldn't have survived 30 minutes. And they think it's because he had so much alcohol in his system that he stayed calm. When normally it is not recommended to drink alcohol and then be in cold water because it actually causes you to get hypothermia quicker. But it worked for him, and before he was off the ship, he was throwing deck chairs into the water, trying to give people something to hold on to. He was throwing women into lifeboats. He's just awesome. Anyway, about this time, she straightened up on an even keel again and started to go down fairly fast at an angle of about 30 degrees. As she started to sink, we left the davits and went back and stood by the rail aft, even with the second funnel. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is not Charles Jockin. He was on the previous page. This is, I think this is Jack Thayer. Sorry. Still, the baker's awesome, but this is Jack Thayer. Long and myself stood by each other and jumped on the rail. We did not give each other any messages for home because neither of us thought we would ever get back. Long put his legs over the rail while I straddled it. Hanging over the side and holding onto the rail with his hands, he looked up at me and said, "You are coming, boy, aren't you?" I replied, "Go ahead, I'll be with you in a minute." He let go and slid down the side and I never saw him again. Almost immediately after he jumped, I jumped. All this last part took a very short time, and when we jumped we were about 10 yards above the water. Long was perfectly calm all the time and kept his nerve to the very end. That's just so sad. There was no panic. This is from Mrs. Thomas Porter. There was no panic. Everyone seemed more stunned than anything else. We watched for upwards of 2 hours the gradual sinking of the ship, first one row of light and then another disappearing at shorter and shorter intervals, with the bow well bent in the water as though ready for a dive. After the lights went out some 10 minutes before the end, she was like some great living thing who made a last superhuman effort to right herself, and then, failing, dove bow forward to the unfathomable depths below. This is from H.S. Etches, a steward. And he's talking about how he saw Bruce Ismay, who was the owner of White Star Line, and a much debated character. Mr. Murdoch called out, and at that moment a female came up whom he did not recognize. Mr. Ismay said, "Come along, jump in." She said, "I am only a stewardess." He said, "Never mind, you are a woman, take your place." And that just got me, because even then, when it's life or death, this woman feels like she needs to say she's only a stewardess. You know, does she deserve to be saved? This is a nice account by Miss Elizabeth W. Schutz. It's called "When the Titanic Went Down." Man's part was the pushing of the good ship, pushing against all reason, to save what? A few hours and lose 1,000 souls, to have the largest of ships arrive in port even a few hours sooner than anticipated. Risk all, but push, push, on. The icebergs could be avoided. Surely man's experience ought to have lent aid, but just so surely it did not. And then she says, she's talking about what she was wearing. Now I began to wish for the warm velvet suit I'd left hanging in my cabin. I had thought of it for a minute, and then had quickly thrown on a lighter weight skirt. I knew the heavier one would make the life preserver less useful. Had I only known how calm the ocean was that night, I would have felt that death was not so sure, and would have dressed for life, rather than for the end. That sentence really got me. Because she just didn't think she was going to survive, so she was trying to make her time in the water easier by wearing a lighter weight outfit. And then when she sees the Carpathia, that same ship that had come to save us might run us down, but no, she is still. The two, the ship and the dawn, came together, a living painting. White was the vessel, but whiter still were those horribly beautiful icebergs, and as we drew nearer and nearer that good ship, we drew nearer to those mountains of ice. As far as the eye could see, or as far as the eye could reach, they rose, each one more fantastically chiseled than its neighbor. The floe glistened like a never-ending meadow covered with new-fallen snow. Those same white mountains, marvelous in their purity, had made of the just-ended night one of the blackest the sea has ever known, and near them stood the ship which had come in such quick response to the Titanic's call for help. The man who works over hours is always the worthwhile kind, and the Marconi operator, awaiting a belated message, had heard the poor ship's call for help, and we, few out of so many, were saved. That's one of the images that always sticks with me that's been described by the survivors, that they could see the rescue ship coming when dawn broke, and it was the most beautiful sunrise, and just like pink and orange and all these colors that were like being reflected off the icebergs because they could now see that they were surrounded by icebergs. It's just a heartbreakingly beautiful image. So here they're examining Mr. Ismay. It says, had it occurred to you, apart perhaps from the captain, that you, as the representative managing director, deciding the number of lifeboats, owed your life to every other person on the ship? So they went really hard on Bruce Ismay, and this guy especially, he kept basically saying you should have died, you should have just sacrificed yourself. But then somebody says, what would have been the point of that? Mr. Edwards has said that it was Mr. Ismay's plain duty to go about the ship looking for passengers, but the fact is that the boat was being lowered. The lifeboat that he got into was already actively being lowered. Was it the duty of Mr. Ismay to have remained, though by doing so no other life could have been saved? If he had been impelled to commit suicide of that kind, then it would have been stated that he went to the bottom because he dared not face this inquiry. There is no observation of an unfavorable nature to be made from any point of view upon Mr. Ismay's conduct. There was no duty devolving upon him of going to the bottom with his ship as the captain did. He did all he could to help the women and children. It was only when the boat was being lowered that he got into it. He violated no point of honor, and if he had thrown his life away in the manner now suggested, it would be said he did it because he was conscious he could not face this inquiry, and so he had lost his life. And that's a good point. He clearly states there were no other women around, and the boat was being lowered. Nobody could have been saved at that point because the boat was going. So he got into it. And I can't blame him for that, but I see both sides of it. This is someone talking about Ismay's duty. For all the loss of life, the company is responsible, individually and collectively. Mr. Ismay personally, not only as one of the members, he believed the Titanic unsinkable. The belief relieves of moral guilt, but not of responsibility. Men bear the consequences of their mistakes as well as of their faults. He and Admiral Chadwick justify his leaving over 1,500 persons, the death of each one of whom lay on the company, on the ground that it was the last boat half filled, and Mr. Ismay has said no one else to be seen. I just thought that was an interesting point. It relieves him moral guilt because he truly did believe the ship was unsinkable. But it doesn't relieve him of responsibility. This is John Collins in the U.S. Inquiry, and the interviewer asks him, how long have you followed the sea? And I just like that statement. How long have you followed the sea? That's such a romantic way to say it. And then his response is heartbreaking. This was my first voyage on the Titanic. Imagine that being your first ever voyage, and this is what happens. And a lot of people went back to work on the sea after this because that was their life. It was their job. It was their means of living and providing for their loved ones. So they didn't really have much of a choice. This is from Harold Bride, who I think we already talked about. He was the junior Marconi operator, and he's really cool. I like him a lot. It says the night before, and this is him writing to the manager of the Marconi company. Like, there was just so much after the disaster. Like, he had to write to his employer, give a statement to them. You know, you didn't just survive and then life goes on. There was so much that they had to deal with. The night before the disaster, Mr. Phillips and myself, Mr. Phillips is the head Marconi operator, had a deal of trouble owing to the leads from the secondary of the transformer having burnt through the inside the casing and make contact with certain iron bolts holding the woodwork and frame together, thereby earthing the power to a great extent. After binding these leads with rubber tape, we once more had the apparatus in perfect working order, but not before we had put in nearly 6 hours' work. Mr. Phillips being of the opinion that in the first place it was the condensers which had broken, and these we had out and examined before locating the damage in the transformer. Owing to this trouble, I had promised to relieve Mr. Phillips on the following night at midnight instead of the usual time, 2 o'clock, as he seemed very tired. So it's just all these events that led up to the disaster, and I find this really interesting because the Marconi the system broke, and it's like in their contract that they're not supposed to touch it. They're supposed to wait till they get to land, and then the engineers fix it. But thank God they fixed it, because if they had not repaired the machine, that would have been it. They never would have been able to send out any SOS, and there wouldn't be any survivors. So, you know, sometimes it pays to go a little bit rogue. And then there's this part where they know the ship is sinking, and Mr. Phillips is still working, sending out signals to other ships. It says, leaving Mr. Phillips operating, I went to our sleeping cabin and got all our money together, returning to find a fireman or coal trimmer gently relieving Mr. Phillips of his life belt. There immediately followed a general scrimmage with the three of us. Just imagine that. There's somebody, the way that he says it, gently relieving him of his life belt. Well, the guy was trying to steal Phillips's life belt because he didn't have one. But what a horrible scene, you know, that they had to get into this fight just in the hopes of being able to save their own lives. And then Harold Bride says the humor of the situation appealed to me, and I cut in with a little remark that made us all laugh, including the captain. Send SOS, I said. It's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it. So typically, or before this, the distress signal was CQD, and it had just been changed to SOS because it's very easy to recognize in Morse code. I think it's 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, or 3 dashes, 3 dots, something like that. It's really obvious what it is. So they just, like internationally this was changed, and Titanic was the first ship to ever send SOS. I can't read. What does that say? The water was pretty close up to the boat deck. There was a great scramble aft, and how poor Phillips worked through it I don't know. He was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt for him a great reverence to see him standing there sticking to his work while everybody else was raging about. I will never live to forget the work Phillips did for the last awful 15 minutes. Phillips clung on, sending and sending. He clung for about 10 minutes, or maybe 15 minutes after the captain released him. The water was then coming into our cabin. And this is from Margaret Brown, known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. I was walking away, eager to see what was being done with the boats on the other side, not fearing any immediate danger, thinking if the worst should happen, I could swim out. Suddenly I saw a shadow, and a few seconds later I was taken hold of, and with the words, "You are going too," I was dropped fully 4 feet into the lowering lifeboat. I just love her attitude, that she just was interested in what was going on. You know, what's being done on the other side of the ship? How is this playing out? And I can always swim out if the boats are gone. She was a brave lady. And then she talks about the person who was in charge of their boat. The quartermaster in command of our boat burst out in a frightened voice and warned us of the fate that awaited us, telling us our task in rowing away from the sinking ship was futile, as she was so large that in sinking she would draw everything for miles around down with her suction, and if we escaped that, the boilers would burst and rip up the bottom of the sea, tearing the icebergs asunder and completely submerge us. We were truly doomed either way. He dwelt on the dire fate awaiting us, narrating at great length the incidents that had happened at Liverpool, how 2 large steamers, the New York and one other, were drawn under and almost capsized, we all the while bending to the oars with a vengeance, tugging on. So yeah, he was really having a very hard time. He was extremely afraid, and there's a lot of accounts of his behavior in the lifeboat. I thought this was an interesting point. She says that, you know, when she gets to New York and she'll be staying in the Ritz-Carlton, and she promises to help people, women who are trying to find the people they were supposed to be meeting in New York, because the addresses of those people, their husbands had the addresses, and their husbands went down with the ship. So I just thought that was a really interesting point that I hadn't considered, that there were so many women who were widowed, and of course they wouldn't even have the information of who they're going to meet, because a lot of people were going to America to start new lives, start businesses, they're immigrating, and imagine ending up in this foreign country and you don't even know where you're supposed to be, and you're also grieving because you've lost your husband. I mean, it's just horrible. And then she's talking about being on the Carpathia, and says, looking up, I saw the face of the man and his friend who had told me to get my life preserver, and who later put me into the boat when I was walking away on the Titanic. Putting out my hand, it is needless to say how profuse I was in expressing my gratitude. She asks their names, and then it says, in seeing the distress of many women who were bereft of their husbands and some who had perished, it made them feel extremely embarrassed, and their attitude in keeping out of sight, other than when they came to the dining salon for meals, was that of men feeling that their lives being saved was somewhat of a stigma, and the worn expression of their faces, as though they continually asked themselves the question, what woman's place in the lifeboat did they fill? And in an apologetic manner, they told how inadvertently they caught the last boat being lowered half empty. They told me of the navigation laws restricting men from the boats when women and children were on board. I replied that such must have been the ancient law, and now that equal rights existed, truly all should be relieved as I chance, that their conscience on that score should be relieved, as I was a living evidence of their thoughtfulness to womankind, as at the time they placed me in the boat I had no intention of getting off, but was most concerned in knowing what was taking place on the other side of the steamer, and marveling all the while at the clumsiness of the crew in letting down the lifeboats. So yeah, all the men on the rescue ship, they were just feeling terrible that they had survived, and that's something that no one should have to feel. You shouldn't feel guilt for surviving, but they saw all these widows and thought, why me and not their husband? Or why me and why not the many women who died? She's talking about Jack Thayer. He was on board the Carpathia when his mother was hoisted from the lifeboat. She was under the impression that both her husband and son had perished on the Titanic, but to her supreme joy she was clasped in her son's arms, in her great thankfulness in having one spared her, for the rest of the voyage not more than a few minutes at a time which she permitted to be separate from her. The attitude of the men who were rescued was indeed pathetic. Each and all seemed as though they were trying to efface themselves. When they were encountered passing to and fro, it was noticed how they all tried to explain how it came about like a miracle that their lives were saved, with an expression of apology as though it were a blight on their manhood. One man displaying an order he had demanded from the officer when asked to get into the lifeboat half filled with women that he might row, all stating that they took the boats when there was no one around to get in. Sorry, the lighting in this is really terrible. I hope that's just not too awful to watch. This is from Walter Nichols. And these are in newspapers. We saw the ship gradually settling down at the bow until the forepart of the ship wasn't visible. Part of the time the band was still playing and we could hear the wireless. About an hour after we left her, the forepart of the boat was going under, and that was the first time we realized that she was going to sink, because up to this time, the men in the boat had taken the whole thing as a sort of holiday. So people really, really didn't think it was going to sink. So a lot of the men who were crew saw it as, oh, we're just getting away from the ship for a little while. I was surprised the way they let us through. This is when they got to New York. No quarantine stop and no bother with the customs. I didn't expect that they would let us members of the crew off the ship, but I just walked off and no one interfered with me. Now I guess I'll have to start in and look for another job. That was the reality. You know, you've got PTSD and now look for another job. Especially because the crew's pay stopped when the ship sank. You know, they were going to have a couple more days of the voyage and a couple more days of pay, but no more pay as soon as the ship was gone. This is from... Oh, this is all, I don't really know who this is, compiled, accounts by someone. The House of Shelter maintained by the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society announced that it was able to care for at least 50 persons as long as might be necessary. The German Society of New York, the Irish Immigrant Society, the Italian Society, the Swedish Immigrant Society, and the Young Men's Christian Association were among the organizations that also offered to see that no needy survivor would go without shelter. Thought that was really, really nice to hear. So many people came together to help. This is talking about the crowds at the dock. On the whole, it was a frantic, grief-crazed crowd. Laborers rubbed shoulders with millionaires. The relatives of the rich had taxicabs waiting outside the docks. The relatives of the poor went there on foot in the rain, ready to take their loved ones. I was really moved by these accounts of the people waiting to see the survivors. It says, seated where they had been assigned beneath the big customs letters corresponding to the initials of the names of the survivors they came to meet, sat the mass of 2,000 on the pier. I mean, there were just so many people waiting there. And they talk about, like, the first survivors coming off the ship, and there's so much emotion running through this crowd, and it really moved me because what are they waiting to see? They're not waiting to see, did someone save the jewels? Did you get your wallet? Is all the money okay? They're waiting to see human faces. Human beings who would eventually die anyway. All the survivors are dead. But at this point in time, these people were special to other people. They meant the world to other people. You know, we need each other. And I don't know, it just struck me as very, very beautiful and moving. The love that human beings can have for other humans, though we are just here for... The camera died. What I was saying is that humans are only here for such a short amount of time. We don't last very long, but while we're here, there are people that are just everything to us. And it's these very human stories that makes this disaster so compelling. Now I completely lost my place. Where the heck was that? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So to lighten the mood a little bit, this was just a bit funny. A sign of the times. It says Magistrate Cornell's wife and her two sisters were among the first to leave the ship. They were met at the first cabin pier entrance by Magistrate Cornell and a party of friends. None of the three women had hats. Okay, and then it says the three women appeared to be in a very nervous state. Their hair was more or less disheveled. They were apparently fully dressed save for their hats. This is a very short statement, and they had to get hats in there twice because it's just so crazy that women wouldn't have their hats on at this point. I mean, hats just completed your outfit in the Edwardian era. So I just love that that was noteworthy. And this is talking about, as the survivors are leaving the ship and telling their stories. It says, far into the night, the recitals were made. They were told in the rooms of hotels, in the wards of hospitals, and upon trains that sped towards saddened homes. It was a symposium of horror and heroism, the like of which has not been known in the civilized world since man established his dominion over the sea. I'm sweating so much. This is not the place to be wearing a sweatshirt, but I had to because it's my Titanic sweatshirt. Okay, now this is Lawrence Beasley's account in the New York Times. I do not say, however, that an iceberg is an easy thing to detect, even with a searchlight, but it would seem quite possible to see a berg quite far ahead to avoid it. I'm done talking. I suppose no one has any doubt that the Titanic would be safe now had there been a searchlight fitted on her. The conditions for its use were ideal that night. So he's giving a lot of, he's talking about the what ifs and trying to figure out, should we place blame on anyone? Do we need to place blame on anyone? What's the point of doing that? But he's saying it sure would have been nice if there was a searchlight on the ship. And it does seem wild that there wasn't one. The provision of sufficient boats to enable each passenger to claim a seat is an elementary precaution. It should be compulsory on the steamship companies to assign a numbered place in a particular boat to each passenger. Passenger drills with the crew assigned to each boat should also be compulsory. There would be no necessity for the enforcement of the unwritten law of women and children first, for all would have a place. The forcing apart of wife from husband, the painful scenes of parting such as the Titanic witnessed, would not be possible. So he's going through the people that have been blamed, like Ismay and Captain Smith, and Murdoch. And it says, it is said, too, that when he did see the berg, he should have headed for her, that the glancing blow cut her open in the most vulnerable place. But what a choice to have to make. How many men would have the courage to head for the berg when every instinct told them to turn the ship away, even supposing it was not the best thing to turn her away? I cannot see how he is to blame. Which is a very good point. I mean, it's easy for us to say now, with the information that we have, that they should have just hit it head on. Because of the fact that the ship turned, it ripped the whole side of the ship as it passed the iceberg, which is why the water got into so many of the compartments. Who knows what would have happened if they had just hit it head on? Maybe it wouldn't have gone down. Maybe it would have gone down so slowly that they would have had time to get everyone off the ships, ferry them to rescue ships. We don't know, but imagine trying to make that decision. You see something like that coming, you want to turn the ship. You're not thinking mathematically, and who knows? So now he's talking about the captain. He took the risk which many other captains have taken. What the chances were in taking the risk, no man can say, but in his case the awful thing happened that should never have happened. In the case of all other captains who have taken a similar risk, it did not happen. If he is to be blamed, it seems that they are all equally blamable for the disaster, for he took the same risk as they did, no more or no less. Remember how the fastest boats are timed to run, leave New York Wednesday, dine in London the following Monday, and it is done. It's a very good point. People talked about how Captain Smith was the one in charge of the speed of the ship, and they were going so fast through the dark in a place where it was known that there was ice. But as he's saying, this was something that was just the norm. That's the risk that captains took all the time, and it just happened to not work out for this one. So if we're going to blame him, we blame all of them. And he says even Captain Rostron, who was the captain of the Carpathia, the rescue ship, should we blame him? Captain Rostron had his own ship and passengers to consider, and he could not take too great a risk. The fact that he took it at all means it was not considered to be such a danger as we, who have known only the abnormal and not the normal result of taking the risk, might suppose. I do not think anyone can say Captain Smith can be held solely responsible. So he says, when Titanic struck, everyone said, "Well, we are all right. This boat cannot sink. We shall have to wait here until another ship comes along to take us off." This, I have little doubt, stopped panic and prevented those rushes for boats, which might have taken place had the theory not been so widely and firmly held. Because it was another thing stated that the fact that everybody thought it was unsinkable is the reason that people would not get into the lifeboats. So many people were afraid to leave this safety that they saw as the Titanic and get into these tiny boats on the open ocean. And that's the reason why so many people died. But this is a very interesting counterpoint to that, which is that they thought it was unsinkable, so there wasn't a panic. And if there had been a panic, maybe less people would have made it. And then he goes and talks about a very math thing. Every student of mechanics knows that the striking impact of a moving body is determined by its momentum, and the formula big M equals little m times v is a statement of the principle that the momentum of a body is equal to the product of the mass into the velocity. So he's talking about how huge this ship is. That's what makes the difference in how hard it hits something. There's one more person whose responsibility should be considered, and I have purposely left him to the last because he is the most important. He's the average man who travels. Columbus took 90 days in a 40-ton ship. A friend of mine crossed 50 years ago in a paddle steamer that took 6 weeks, and now we cross in something over 4 days. And all the time, M and V in the formula are increasing, and their product M is raised day by day until one shudders at the craze for speed and luxury, for in ships, size spells luxury. The public demand it, and the lines supply it, and that is why the Titanic sank. And here's a very sad bit here. Now to consider one or two other matters arising out of the disaster. I should like to ask readers of the New York Times a question that has occurred to me in studying the lists of the rescued. It is this: what is the relative value of the lives of a first-class passenger and a steerage passenger? I have worked out the percentage of the saved of the 4 classes, and find it as follows: first class, 63.6%; second class, 39%; steerage, 26.7%; officers and crew, 22.3%. They are instructive, those figures. The payment of about £15 excess of first over third gives you more than twice the chance of your life being saved. Who can say that a first-class passenger's life is of more value to the community than that of a steerage passenger? It may be that it is actually so at this present time, but perhaps not potentially so. But the possession of a few more pieces of a particular metal determines the value of a life and not the relative merits of such life. Okay, we'll end it there. That was another long video, but I cannot be stopped. I just love talking about Titanic. So I highly recommend this book. It's just, yeah, I was getting goosebumps. I was tearing up. I was just feeling very moved the entire time because I hadn't really read so many first accounts before. So, oh, and you have to see, the cover is very cool. And now, I'm so done talking. I will see you all next time, and I don't even know with what because I just finished this, and this was a very busy Titanic week. So, drop some Titanic facts in the comments. See if you can tell me something that I haven't read before. That would be cool. And until I see you next time, happy reading.